The SS believed victory was a matter of copying genius. They thought the Allies' codes were just puzzles waiting to be stolen, formulas they could reverse engineer with brute force. But brilliance is not brute force. Across a dimly lit room in England, mathematicians, linguists, and even young women bent over machines and papers were quietly cracking ciphers that decided the fate of nations. Each letter, each pattern, each key discovered brought the Allies closer to knowing what the enemy would do next. Meanwhile, the SS fumbled with imitation machines, blindly guessing, desperately trying to match what they could not understand. Time was slipping through their fingers, and every mistake cost lives on the battlefield. In a race where intellect outran arrogance, the hubris of the SS collided with the ingenuity of the unseen heroes, and the consequences would echo across the war. Berlin, 1943. The war had turned. What seemed like inevitable victory for the Third Reich now felt uncertain. Allied forces were reading German communications with disturbing accuracy. Convoys were being ambushed. U-boats were being hunted down before they could strike. Battle plans were somehow anticipated. In a secure building on Prince Albertstrasse, SS commanders gathered around a polished oak table. Maps covered the walls, intelligence reports lay scattered before them, and in the center of it all sat a single question that burned through their pride. How were the Allies doing this? Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo, slammed his palm on the table. The Allies had broken German codes, that much was clear. But if they could do it, why couldn't the Reich? Why couldn't German intelligence replicate what the British had achieved? After all, weren't they supposed to be the superior minds? The answer, they convinced themselves, was simple. The Allies must have machines. They must have systems, and systems could be copied. Genius could be replicated. It was just a matter of effort, resources, and German determination. They were catastrophically wrong. The mission was announced with characteristic SS arrogance. A special unit would be assembled. The brightest cryptographers in the Reich would be gathered. They would study Allied successes, reverse engineer their methods, and build Germany's own code-breaking operation. They would turn the invisible war of intelligence back in Germany's favor. The men selected for this task were not fools, far from it. They were mathematicians from universities, linguists with multiple languages, engineers who understood complex machinery. Some had worked on the Enigma machine itself. Others had backgrounds in signals intelligence. They arrived at their new assignment with a mixture of confidence and curiosity. What they didn't understand yet, what none of them could fully grasp, was the sheer scale of what they were attempting to replicate. The Allied code-breaking effort wasn't just a machine or a method. It was an ecosystem of brilliance, collaboration, and relentless innovation that had taken years to build. But the SS didn't want to hear about impossibilities. They wanted results. The team began by studying what little intelligence they had about Allied operations. Captured documents hinted at mechanical decryption devices. Interrogations of prisoners suggested large-scale operations involving hundreds of people. Reconnaissance had identified facilities in England where something significant was happening, though the exact nature remained mysterious. The SS cryptographers started with what they knew. The Enigma machine was Germany's pride, a marvel of engineering that generated billions of possible encryption combinations. Surely the Allies had built something similar to crack it. The task then was to build a machine that could break codes the way the Allies apparently did. They acquired several Enigma machines for study. They analyzed the rotor systems, the plugboard configurations, the daily key settings. They began constructing prototype devices designed to test rotor positions rapidly. Early tests showed promise. With enough time and the right starting assumptions, they could occasionally decrypt messages. The mood was optimistic. Progress reports flowed upward through the SS hierarchy. Müller nodded with satisfaction. Himmler himself expressed interest. The Führer was informed that German intelligence was developing capabilities that would soon match the Allies. But cracks were already forming in this foundation of confidence. The machines kept jamming. The rotors didn't align properly. The electrical connections sparked and failed. And even when everything worked mechanically, the results were gibberish. Hours of calculation produced nothing but random letters. The cryptographers would adjust their assumptions, try again, and fail again. Frustration began to replace confidence. The team worked longer hours. Arguments erupted over methodology. Some insisted they needed better machines. Others claimed the problem was mathematical, not mechanical. A few quietly wondered if they were missing something fundamental about how the Allies approached the problem. They were, but pride prevented them from seeing it clearly. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, a very different kind of operation was unfolding. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, thousands of people worked in a coordinated dance of intelligence gathering and crypto-analysis that the SS couldn't begin to imagine. The Allied operation wasn't built on brute force or blind replication. It was built on insight, on pattern recognition, on mathematical elegance and collaborative problem solving. The people working there understood something the SS didn't. Breaking codes wasn't about building a better machine. It was about understanding the human patterns behind the codes. Alan Turing and his colleagues had developed the bomb, an electromechanical device that didn't just try random combinations. It exploited weaknesses in how human operators used the Enigma machine. German radio operators had habits, patterns, predictable behaviors. They sent weather reports in standard formats. They began messages with routine phrases. They made mistakes. And the Allies weaponized those mistakes. The Bletchley Park operation involved mathematicians who could see patterns in chaos, linguists who understood how language worked beneath encryption, engineers who could build machines to test hypotheses at lightning speed, and hundreds of young women operating the equipment, transcribing intercepts, analyzing traffic patterns, each one a vital part of a system that functioned like a finely tuned orchestra. They worked in shifts around the clock. When one team made a breakthrough, it was passed immediately to the next. Information flowed between departments with practiced efficiency. Everyone understood that speed mattered. A decoded message about a convoy's position was only useful if it reached commanders before the convoy moved. Every day, they decrypted hundreds of German messages, troop movements, supply schedules, U-boat positions, Luftwaffe operations. The intelligence was turned into actionable information and rushed to military commanders. Ships changed course to avoid submarine wolf packs. Bombing raids struck when defenses were weakest. Convoys sailed routes that German vessels had just abandoned. And the Germans never understood why their plans kept failing. Back in Berlin, the SS team was drowning in their inadequacy. They had machines, yes. They had protocols. They had smart people working impossible hours. But nothing worked. The fundamental problem was simple. They were trying to copy results without understanding principles. They saw that the Allies could decrypt Enigma messages, so they tried to build devices that could do the same thing. But they didn't grasp the intellectual framework that made Allied success possible. The SS approach was mechanical and rigid. They would set up their prototype machine with assumed rotor positions and grind through possibilities. Hours later, they might get lucky and decrypt a single message, usually one of their own test transmissions. But when they tried to decrypt actual Allied communications, they got nowhere. They didn't understand that the Allies weren't just decrypting German codes. They were reading German communications in near real time because they had developed deep institutional knowledge about how those codes were used, what mistakes operators made, what shortcuts were taken, what patterns emerged over weeks and months of traffic analysis. The SS team had machines. The Allies had understanding. Time became the enemy. With every passing week, more operations failed. More U-boats were sunk. More supply convoys were intercepted.
The Wehrmacht commanders began to suspect that communication security had been compromised, but they trusted the Enigma's mathematical complexity. The machine generated billions of possible combinations. Breaking it should have been impossible. Yet somehow the impossible was happening every single day. The SS cryptographers tried different approaches. They attempted to steal Allied codebooks through espionage operations. Most of these missions failed or produced outdated information. They tried to capture Allied cryptographic equipment. The few times they succeeded, the equipment was either destroyed before capture or proved useless without the operational knowledge of how to use it.
They tried recruiting foreign mathematicians who might have insights into Allied methods, but the best mathematicians were already working for the Allies or had fled Nazi persecution. The Reich's own racial policies had driven away much of the intellectual talent that might have solved these problems. Desperation crept into the operation. Reports to SS leadership became less confident, more defensive. The cryptographers stopped promising breakthroughs and started making excuses. The machines weren't sophisticated enough. They needed more resources. They needed more time. They needed access to better intelligence about Allied methods. What they really needed was a fundamental rethinking of their approach, but that would have required admitting they had been wrong from the start. And in the SS, admitting error was often fatal. The failures began to have real consequences. When the SS couldn't provide accurate intelligence about Allied codes, German military operations suffered. Plans were made based on the assumption that communications were secure, when in fact the Allies were reading every word. The invasion of North Africa, the Battle of the Atlantic, the defense of Sicily. Again and again, German forces found themselves facing enemies who seemed to know exactly where they would be and what they would do. The advantage of surprise evaporated. The fog of war lifted, but only for one side. In the Atlantic, the Wolfpack tactics that had terrorized Allied shipping began to fail spectacularly. U-boats would move to attack positions only to find that convoys had already changed course. They would surface to recharge batteries and find Allied aircraft waiting for them. Entire submarine groups were hunted down and destroyed because their position reports were being read almost as fast as they were sent. Admiral Donitz couldn't understand it. The Enigma was supposed to be unbreakable. His staff assured him that the encryption was secure, yet the evidence suggested otherwise. He ordered new security procedures, more complex key settings, additional encryption layers. None of it mattered because the fundamental problem remained. The Allies understood the system better than its own creators did. At Bletchley Park, the teams working on Naval Enigma actually welcomed the increased complexity. More complexity meant more data to analyze, more patterns to exploit, more mistakes for operators to make. The bomb machines hummed day and night, processing possibilities at speeds the SS could never match with their crude prototypes. The human element was crucial. German radio operators developed recognizable styles, call signs they used repeatedly, predictable message formats. Allied traffic analysts cataloged these patterns. When a particular operator came on air, the analysts could often guess what type of message was coming and what probable words might appear in it. These cribs dramatically reduced the work needed to break that day's settings. The SS team never developed this kind of systematic approach. They remained focused on the mechanical problem of decryption while missing the human intelligence problem entirely. They built machines when they needed to build understanding. They sought technological solutions when they needed analytical insight. By late 1943, the gap between Allied capabilities and SS capabilities had become an unbridgeable chasm. The Allies were regularly reading high-level German communications within hours of transmission. They knew about military deployments before some German field commanders did. They could predict Luftwaffe raids and evacuate civilian areas. They could sink supply ships before they reached their destinations. And still, incredibly, German high command never fully accepted that the Enigma had been broken. The mathematics said it was impossible. The machine was too complex. There were too many possible combinations. No human effort could possibly break it through brute force. They were right about that last part. No human effort could break Enigma through brute force. But the Allies weren't using brute force. They were using brilliance.
The contrast between the two operations couldn't have been starker. At Bletchley Park, people from different backgrounds collaborated seamlessly. A mathematician might work with a linguist and a chess champion to solve a problem. Class distinctions faded in the urgency of the work. Women operated complex machinery and made crucial analytical decisions. Creativity was encouraged. Unorthodox thinking was valued. In the SS operation, hierarchy was rigid. Orders flowed downward. Initiative was discouraged. The people doing the work couldn't question the fundamental assumptions of their mission because those assumptions came from above. And in a totalitarian system, you don't tell your superiors that their entire approach is flawed.
The psychological burden on the SS cryptographers grew heavier. They knew they were failing. They could see evidence of Allied intelligence successes in every military briefing. They worked longer hours, tried more desperate measures, and achieved nothing of strategic value. Some had nervous breakdowns. Others requested transfers to combat units, preferring the clarity of physical battle to the frustration of intellectual defeat. Leadership responded with predictable brutality. When results didn't improve, the search began for saboteurs and traitors. Surely someone was deliberately sabotaging the program. Surely the failure couldn't be due to simple incompetence or impossible task parameters. Investigations were launched. People were questioned. Some were arrested on fabricated charges. The purges only made things worse. The most creative thinkers, the ones most likely to question failed approaches, were exactly the ones most likely to attract suspicion. What remained was a team of frightened yes-men who continued failed methods because deviating from orders was too dangerous. Meanwhile, Allied cryptographers were breaking new German codes almost as fast as they were introduced. The Luftwaffe codes, the SS's own internal communications codes, even the more complex Lorenz cipher used for high-level strategic communications eventually fell to Allied analysis. The British built Colossus, one of the world's first electronic computers, specifically to break Lorenz. It worked brilliantly. The SS team never even knew Lorenz was compromised. They believed their most secure communications were still secret, while British analysts read transcripts of Hitler's direct orders to field marshals. As 1944 approached, the consequences of this intelligence asymmetry became existential for Germany. The Allies were planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The success of this operation depended heavily on deception and surprise. The Allies needed the Germans to believe the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. They orchestrated an elaborate deception campaign called Operation Fortitude. Fake armies were assembled in England. False radio traffic was transmitted, double agents sent misleading reports, and all of this was carefully monitored through decrypted German intelligence communications to ensure the deception was working. The Allies could read German assessments of where the invasion would come. They could see which deceptions were believed and which were doubted. They adjusted their plans in real time based on what German intelligence was telling its own commanders. It was an unprecedented advantage, and it was only possible because the Allies could read the mail. When D-Day finally came on June 6, 1944, German response was delayed and confused, partly because they had positioned forces based on false intelligence. The beaches of Normandy were more lightly defended than they might have been. German reinforcements were held back because commanders believed the real invasion was still coming at Calais. Days passed before they fully committed to defending Normandy. Thousands of Allied lives were saved because of the intelligence advantage. The invasion succeeded in part because cryptographers in England had been quietly winning an invisible war that the SS had tried and failed to even fight. After the war, when the full extent of Allied cryptographic success was gradually revealed, many Germans were shocked. The enigma had been broken, but that was supposed to be mathematically impossible. The Lorenz had been read, but they had been assured those communications were absolutely secure. The SS's attempt to replicate Allied code-breaking capabilities was exposed as the failure it had always been. Documents revealed the program's existence, its repeated failures, its consumption of resources that might have been spent elsewhere. Some former team members were interrogated by Allied intelligence officers who were professionally curious about what the Germans had tried to do. The answers were almost embarrassing. The SS had built crude machines that didn't work. They had tried approaches that any competent cryptographer could have told them were doomed. They'd wasted years chasing a capability they fundamentally didn't understand. And throughout it all, they had never grasped the basic principle that made Allied success possible. You can't copy genius through force. You can only match it through understanding. The human stories emerged slowly. Allied codebreakers remained silent about their work for decades, bound by secrecy oaths. When they finally could speak, the world learned of young women who operated complex machines and made split-second analytical decisions, of mathematicians who saw patterns no one else could see, of linguists who understood that language has habits even when encrypted, of engineers who built machines that helped human insight work at superhuman speed.
These were people who had fought the war from behind desks and machines, whose names appeared in no medals or honors, whose contributions were hidden even from the soldiers whose lives they saved. They won battles that were never formally declared. They changed the course of history through quiet brilliance. And across from them, the SS had fielded arrogance, force, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what intelligence work actually required. They had believed that victory was a matter of resources and determination. They had thought that copying results would yield the same success as understanding principles. They had assumed that their ideology of superiority would translate into actual superiority. They were wrong about all of it. The SS cryptographic failure was more than just an intelligence defeat. It was a perfect encapsulation of why the Reich was always going to lose this kind of conflict. Totalitarian systems don't innovate well. They don't collaborate effectively. They don't tolerate the kind of intellectual freedom that produces breakthrough insights. They punish creativity and reward obedience, which is exactly backward for any endeavor that requires original thinking. The Allies built systems that empowered brilliant people to do brilliant work. The SS built systems that constrained people and crushed initiative. One approach produced Bletchley Park and its extraordinary success. The other produced a failed program that history would barely remember. There's a broader lesson here about the nature of intelligence, both human and organizational. You cannot copy genius by observing its results. You cannot replicate innovation by stealing its tools. You cannot achieve understanding through force or coercion or blind determination. These things require conditions that allow human creativity to flourish, freedom to question assumptions, and collaboration between different perspectives. The SS had none of these conditions. They had hierarchy, ideology, and arrogance. And when those things encountered the quiet competence of Allied cryptographers, the outcome was never in doubt. Tens of thousands of lives were saved because mathematicians could see patterns, because linguists understood language, because engineers built precise machines, because young women operated equipment with skill and dedication, because all of these people worked together toward a common goal without regard for peacetime social distinctions or professional hierarchies. And tens of thousands of lives were lost because the SS couldn't replicate any of that, no matter how hard they tried. The machines at Bletchley Park hummed quietly through the war, processing intercepts, finding patterns, breaking codes. The machines the SS built sat idle or produced garbage. One group understood what they were doing, the other group only understood that they were failing. In the end, the invisible war of cryptography was decided not by resources or determination or technological sophistication, but by something simpler and more profound. One side understood the problem they were solving, and the other side didn't. The SS tried to copy Allied codebreakers and failed miserably, not because they lacked intelligence or resources, but because they lacked the one thing that couldn't be copied: genuine understanding of their craft. They tried to win through imitation when only innovation would suffice. They tried to force results when only insight would work. They tried to copy genius with brute force and discovered that brilliance is not something you can steal. History remembers Bletchley Park. History barely remembers the SS cryptographic program. That difference tells you everything you need to know about which approach to human intelligence actually works and which one is doomed to fail before it even begins. The quiet heroes who bent over machines and papers in England changed the world. The SS officers who tried to copy them changed nothing except their own understanding of how thoroughly they had been beaten at a game they never learned to play.